Good evening and welcome one and all to the International Workshop on Circular Economy organized by Department of Architecture, School of Planning and Architecture, Bhopal. It's my privilege to address you all on the behalf of SPA Bhopal. We have gathered here today for the official inaugural session followed by the keynote speech. Circular economy, a concept of closed-ended systems and sustainability, multidisciplinary in nature, has a lot of relevance in this globalized world. The significance of this topic is well noted by various international and national organizations working on this knowledge domain. Ensuring sustainable consumption and production, goal number 12 of UN SDGs reiterates its importance. This workshop aims at understanding the various aspects of circular economy, its systemic approach, and how it could be a key factor in various disciplines in tackling climate change and fostering sustainable habitats. The recent COP26 UN Climate Change Conference also urges a global transition to accelerate and implement circular economy in multiple sectors. So this workshop is also a platform to share the knowledge and reach out to a larger audience. The next 2 days, we are joined by a number of experts from different parts of the world to share their research and expertise. Other than lectures, there will be short exercises to encourage participation and discussions to exchange ideas. I'm happy and thankful that some of our experts have joined in this inaugural session. I'm extremely delighted to mention that our participants have connected from across the globe and are from diverse backgrounds. I'm sure that there will be a lot of takeaways and new learnings to carry forward and bring circular economy into practice. I welcome all the participants, expert speakers, faculties, and students of SPA Bhopal to this workshop and inaugural session. We are truly delighted with your esteemed presence. May I now request Dr. Piyush Hajela, Head, Department of Architecture, SPA Bhopal, to preside over the session.
Dear participants and the eminent speakers in the panels, a warm welcome once again to you all on behalf of the Department of Architecture here at SPA Bhopal. Circular economy is a very important topic in the current affairs of our cities, with specific reference to making our cities more sustainable with optimum use of our natural resources, where circular systems have a symbiotic relationship with nature. This will only reduce the burden on the resources, but also develop and create economical environments. The deliberations on this subject spread over the next 3 days would be necessary to understand from the point of view of built environments we all stay in. More so to us as architects, urban designers, planners, environmentalists, as well as the professionals from the allied fields who have a great role to play. It's both our individual as well as collective responsibility to keep a close watch on the functions of circular economy. For this, we need to understand the various ingredients of this subject. I think this is a crucial topic that has drawn attention of all across the world, as it also focuses on the sustainability aspects of our built environment. Climate change, global warming, pollution are few such factors that can be effectively addressed by circular economy. I am sure that the deliberations on the topic over the next 3 days would be fruitful, bring in gainful knowledge to the participants, and encourage each of us to contribute in a big way to the sustained built environment that we and the generations to come would like to see in future. Imbalances not only creates loss to economy, but also causes irreparable loss to human habitat. This will also support in achieving the sustainable development goals proposed by UN agenda. I once again welcome all the event speakers who will be delivering their lectures during the 3-day workshop, as well as the participants. Thank you. And now I request and welcome our director, Professor N. Sridharan, to address the gathering.
Thank you, Dr. Piyush Hajela, for this very good, program on circular economy. First time I came across something from architecture department coming out with that international one mixed with Delft and NTNU. We had a lot of collaboration with them in terms of knowledge partner. I welcome all the participants as well as the experts who are going to participate in this. Rightly, who found out, I mean, the right person, architect Rahul Mehrotra, to start off with this. That is something great because he has been working on this field for years in action, and how he has done it and in terms of books. Okay, we'll start off with a good kickoff from this particular thing, and then I'm sure we will take it further for these 2 days. Well, when this idea was conceptualized by Sureka, immediately I said, grab it. Let's do this. And because we are not still trying to do it in terms of architecture, because circular economy, when it started off, it's more in terms of informal sector and how to do it, how to do them. From that point of view, economy point of view, it was thought about it. But later on, it went into engineering, it went into the how to use the circulate the resources. But very little thing has been done in terms of architecture. So this is a good opportunity for us to explore it further. I still remember way back in 1990s when two leading person who talked about Pierce and Turner talked about this circular economy. They did talk about resources, production, consumption, utilities, waste, and recycling. Still at the time, they never thought about that how it can be done in terms of architecture. Okay. Now we are applying it in this case, and then how to do it in various concepts within architecture. That's something very good that you initiated with this. Now going back to a fortunate thing which we had, just for the past 3 days, we have been discussing about the Foundation Day lecture series as well as convocation. They did, in fact, the convocation address chief also talked about this climate change, how it is related to circular economy, how we talked about the various concepts of architecture. In many of them, whoever talked about it, they did mention about this. Little bit after this in terms of sustainable development goals. If we go into the details, as I said, initially we talked about only about SDG 8, that is about the workers to make them employed and how to get employed. But it does talk about 1 and 2, that is poverty and what you call hunger. That's also very strongly related to circular economy. And so also 6, 7, 8, that is clean water. It's talk about clean energy. We talk about, of course, 8 is about the workforce and about most important sustainable habitat, where the architect makes a major role into this, and where we are talking about affordable housing, where the land is very costly. So how to make the building itself is more affordable is a big question for us, which is a challenge for us, how to do this. And as rightly pointed out Sureka in the beginning address, it's interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary also synchronized with what the national education policy talks about. Interdisciplinary in terms of education, in terms of the various aspects, how to apply it also comes in. So the overall, instead of putting further and further, I want to talk about this in terms of environmental, talk about ecological depletion. All these challenges comes in together for a habitat to issues. And being in habitat, that's the main thing which the architects have to take it further and then make it in terms of a circular economy, how we can make it. Of course, utensils and in the steels and all, they do use it, but in terms of other things, how to make it the product, okay, different product. Now we have the related to climate change, say how to use the agricultural usage waste also, how to use it for this. Now, it's a big challenge for us as an architect. Still, we have not yet started in India that much. It's a very minuscule. Now, I'm sure with these discussions, with these deliberations, with this kind of conferences on a regular basis, I'm sure we can take it deep into this. And then our curriculum also should be tuned to this in terms of in the future. I welcome all the participants. I really thanks the HOD of architecture and also especially Sureka, who talked about this to start off with this. And I'm sure other faculty will also get into this and then detail it further. And wish you all the people here associated with this to make this program very, very successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Piyush Hajela and Dr. N. Sridharan for their kind words. Now, may I request our Dean Academics, Dr. Nikhil Ranjan Mandal, to deliver some words.
Thank you, Dr. Surekha. I am really grateful that you called me for this inaugural session. First and foremost, let me wish all the participants and some of the experts who have joined a very good day. I don't know, they might be from different parts, but it is afternoon in India. The first and foremost, as I think about this whole workshop, I find that it is so timely because circular economy, as of course the concept came strongly in the 80s, it started in the 70s. We are yet to adopt formally a policy in this regard in cases of city management. But when I remember my own childhood days, through informal means, very likely we had a more stronger circular economy, except for in the case of industries, where what they produced and as we used, our waste need not necessarily were again reaching the industries after extraction of the raw materials. However, for rest of the things, for example, I remember in our childhood, in our houses, there would be groups of people, mostly ladies, who would come and exchange our old clothes with some kind of utensils. The plates on which we used to eat used to be usually made of brass, and it could be resold. Majority of things, as students, as we have grown up, all the papers would be reused for making small packets for selling groceries or selling food items. But now all these have reduced in India, at least from where I stand and as I see, this thing has changed a little bit. So we used to have in our informal sector some kind of a circular economy, which very likely, though I do not have research to say that what was its quantum and how much it has reduced, or actually whether it has increased, I am not in a position to say, but as my perception goes, this has most likely reduced a little bit. A second thing that then brings us to is that right now we are having a scheme in India called Swachh Bharat Mission. And through this Swachh Bharat Mission, we can now see that some amount of formalization of this particular aspect is actually coming through. That is to say that where we are dumping our waste, we are actually setting up as well. And that is recycling centers, waste to compost plants, waste to energy plants, and of course the recyclable materials are being sold off to some agencies who are going to use. So this in the last few years, that is the Swachh Bharat Mission started in 2014, and till date a lot of progress has been made. So a lot of recyclable centers, recycling centers, a lot of waste to energy plant actually coming up on ground, and a lot of waste to compost plants actually have come up on ground. But then this brings us to the challenge of collection of material extracts and helping it to reach the prospective users. Now, since it is being organized from the architecture department, one will start thinking about the building sector first as a focus area. Other aspects also would surely be considered, but if the focus area is building sector, then one starts again wondering about this aspect. Although the concept of cradle to cradle design was mooted long time ago, but we continue to use materials that do not actually conform to this concept. And most likely it will not come up so easily in very near future also. So we will be actually saddled with waste of building construction. That is If a building is going to be brought down and the site is going to be redeveloped, the construction waste material would remain. Now in Indian cities, in many places, there are grounds where this kind of building construction material gets dumped. But then recycling of this waste material is not necessarily very smooth. I remember long time back, somewhere around 2004, I met with a person in Mumbai who actually was taking all this waste of building construction to a site and making new building materials out of this after crushing the building blocks. Of course, a later concept had come that, okay, everything has to be modular so that it can be reused again in buildings. But then the policies are not that way in place, and a real development in that direction has not happened. If we look at even the road construction also in India particularly, we are in a little difficult stage. If I take case example of the city from where I am speaking right now in Bhopal, and if I take a very close example also, just beside our own campus, we have a concrete road, but then part of the concrete road had cracked. And that part, the concrete top was actually removed. And where it is lying, it has not been moved to any dumping ground, but it is actually lying along the shoulder of the road till date, and it is already more than 2 years. We do not have a method of removing the construction waste and reusing the construction waste in new road construction. So we have to actually explore ways of doing this. We have to put steps and procedural steps in our city management to actually take care of this. And we have to also explore ways of how to help the informal sector actually to engage more in the circular economy, apart from, of course, the industry sector, which to some extent is right now involved in circular economy. So I wish to listen to all these explorations from all the experts, researchers, and those who are going to discuss the best practices from across the world. Thank you so much for calling me to this workshop. Thank you again, and hope that all the participants find it really, really useful, and then it gives a spark to all of you to actually work in this domain. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. We'll wait a couple of minutes. Our speaker has not joined yet. He has communicated that he'll be joining in 5 minutes. Dear participants, all expert speakers and faculty of SPA Bhopal and all the students will be joining we'll be starting our keynote speech in 5 to 10 minutes. We're just waiting for the keynote speaker to join. Officially, we have done with our inaugural session, and sharp 5:30 we'll start with the keynote. Good evening, sir.
Hello, hi, how are you?
I'm good, sir. Okay. Yes, so now it's time for our keynote speech. It's my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker for today, Architect Rahul Mehrotra, Founder Principal, RMA Architects, Mumbai and Boston, Chair of Department of Urban Planning and Design, Harvard University Graduate School of Design, Cambridge. Mr. Mehrotra is a practicing architect, urban designer, and educator. He has designed and executed projects that range from recycling urban land and master planning in Mumbai to the design of art spaces, boutiques, weekend houses, factories, social institutes, and offices across India, thereby engaging diverse issues, multiple constituencies, and varying scales from interior design, architecture to urban design, conservation, and planning. Mr. Mehrotra has also written and lectured extensively on various issues with architecture, conservation, urban planning in Mumbai and India. Some of his writings include Bombay, The Cities Within, Anchoring a City Line, Changing Perspectives, Conserving an Image Center. And in 2011, he has written a book on architecture in India since 1990, which was extended through an exhibition co-curated at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Mumbai. From 2012 to 2015, he led a Harvard University-wide research project with Professor Diana Ek called the Kutum Mela, mapping the ephemeral megacity. This work was published as a book in 2014. His research was extended in 2017 in the form of a book titled Does Permanence Matter? The research was also extended into an invited exhibition at the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale. Mr. Mehrotra's research on urbanism is focused on evolving a theoretical framework for designing in conditions of informal growth, what he refers to as the kinetic city. Some of his recent projects of the firm include the library block for the School of Architecture at CEPT, Ahmedabad, the Faculty of Arts and Science at Ahmedabad University, and School of Public Policy, IIM, Ahmedabad. And in 2018, RMA Architects were awarded the Venice Architecture Biennale's Jury Special Mention for 3 projects that address issues of intimacy, empathy, gently diffusing social boundaries and hierarchies. A hearty welcome to you, sir, to SPA Bhopal and to this workshop. Over to you for your keynote. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And apologies if I was a few minutes late. It's very early for me. And so I've never done a keynote so early in the morning. So please bear with me. So I'm going to just share my screen. And then we can. Okay, you can see my full screen?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. We can.
Yeah. So you're only seeing one screen, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you again for this invitation. I've been a bit nervous because while I accepted doing this, when I read the program that you sent, and it was circular economy and everyone else who's participating, I was wondering, what place an architect and planner might have among economists and others. But of course, this is the SPA Bhopal, and this is precisely the intersections I suppose you want to create. So I'll try my best to make what I'm saying relevant to the rest of the time that you all are going to be involved in this discussion. And I hope it sort of works for you. So I'm basically going to I think a system-based approach towards sustainability was something that allowed me to at least pick up the problem in a way that might be useful. And I'm going to sort of share with you 3 pieces of research or thinking which have sort of been interconnected, which might be useful in terms of provoking a discussion about the question of the circular economy and what we might even learn from cities or what cities might aspire towards in order to achieve this sort of goal of sustainability, although that's a very broad rubric, whatever it might mean. So the researches are what I think was alluded to in the introduction, which is the notion of the kinetic city, which was extended through this idea of the ephemeral and the ephemeral urbanism. And the last one, which is more specific to India, where one then can see how some of these notions could potentially be embedded in the discourse. And so this is, it's in some ways urban centric, but it also is about trying to blur the binaries that sort of exist between, the ways we situate the world to understand it. So therefore, when I say it's largely focused on the urban, I think the urban-rural binary is inherently deconstructed when one begins to, read urbanism in this way, I think. And I think it's also critical in terms of how we imagine the circular economy, because the binaries are often what don't allow these loops to be sort of completed, or they are limited in terms of methods and modes of exchange. So the urban is something that we, are all petrified of in some ways, the way it's sort of exploding around the world. But what it really means, I think it's worth really deconstructing and looking at more carefully. If you look at even just where urbanism or urban formations are happening in the way we define it, it's very intense, as you can see in India and Europe. It's very continuous, and you can see from this sort of map where those concentrations are. And what's interesting is that the megacities, which we kind of celebrate, and actually we premise a lot of our readings and many best practices and models of how we deal with the urban actually emerge from these conglomerates. What's also interesting is that most of them are coastal cities. Of course, these are legacies that come because of ports of extraction under colonial rule and colonialism around the world. Colonial rule, I was alluding specifically to India. And what's interesting is that these are precisely the places where we are going to be most susceptible to at least the excess water that might be created with the oceans rising through climate change and all of that. And in places like Mumbai, which is a focus of my study, what that animation shows you is it will probably return to the 7 islands from which it was constructed as a factitious city. It was man-made by pushing the sea out. The reclamation will happen now because the sea will reclaim the land. But this is, I think, the fate of many cities which are coastal and mega cities. So it's then a question of too much water or too little water, and these sort of extremes begin. So there are many forms of flux like this that we are beginning to deal with. The flux gets caused, you could argue, by climate change. It's political rife that sort of sometimes emanates from climate change, sometimes from other factors, and it causes forms of instability, but largely also uncertainty. And so therefore the question is, can we extend that wonderful dictum that the architect Charles Correa had, which was form follows climate, but it's really form will have to follow climate change, especially the form of our cities. So in spite of this sort of flux, this mutability, this sort of instability, the uncertainty, we yet actually instrumentalize architecture very centrally in the making of cities. And architecture becomes the central spectacle of the city. It becomes the instrument by which urban design is imagined, by which city form is imagined. And it sort of results in very brittle urban form. I call this the architecture of impatient capital, because capital is inherently impatient, and many cities are premised on allowing their logic or their protocols, their aspirations, often their political energy is premised on allowing capital to arrive and realize its value frictionlessly, and the faster capital realizes its value because of its inherent impatience, that city becomes more attractive. That becomes the paradigm of the Shanghais and the Dubais and the Abu Dhabis. And you get very brittle form, and you get cities of impatient capital as sort of almost singular purpose. Of course, these morph into great places of culture and all of that, but they're essentially extremely brittle form and highly problematic because architecture is so central, and the considerations therefore in their formulations become limited, and then you have the rubrics that emanate from it, which is the notion of the world city, Peter Hall, etc., in the 1960s, which is where cities disproportionately controlled certain powers. Those powers came from previous colonial conditions, and therefore they became centers of consumption and therefore centers of art, culture, and they were projected as these world cities where they kind of represented the world in some ways, of course, largely in terms of power, but also because of advanced professional activity of many kinds, centers of information gathering, diffusion, centers of consumption and art and culture, etc. And then in the 90s, as many parts of the world began to, so to speak, liberalize their economies or began to aspire to become part of a network, also because of manufacturing being offshored in the more powerful economies and to Asia, China. India liberalized its economy in 92 more formally, but from the 1990s it began to do that you had the new definition that became popular, which is global cities, where these were cities that were defined by disproportionate or large, and those metrics and parameters were established by all sorts of people. Saskia Sassen was one of the pioneers in art, not pioneers, but someone who really articulated this within the discourse of urbanism more broadly. It had nothing to do with size or even power. It just had to do with financial power. So places like Dublin were global cities, but they were very small, and mega cities like Mumbai didn't qualify to become global cities, but they were large. The other popular definition, which I think is relevant in many ways, is the UN Habitat definition, which is, and of course the World Bank, IMF, etc., use this, which is a notion of the megacity. And that had cutoffs, I think 5 and then 7 million. But essentially it was a definition premised on population, which means it was the one that was inherently human-centric. And that's what makes it important, because for funding and for loans, I suppose the World Bank and others found this as a productive metric, because it allowed you to use a basis for calculations for water supply systems or for sanitation projects or for transportation, as the MUTP, the famous MUTP, the Mumbai Urban Transportation Project, did, because you could then measure ridership, etc. So it becomes a human-centric, and these are just important to know because we otherwise get seduced by these in our imagination of the city. And so the global city results in the architecture and landscapes of impatient capital. The megacity is important because it is human-centric, and finally I believe that's what cities should be. And now, of course, you have this amazing emergence of the smart city, which is also has its kind of tyrannical dimensions. It premises technology as a central organizing instrument, with the amazing assumption that the domains that technology will network exist. Often they don't exist. And you can see this in the case of the Indian smart cities, how, in my view, it's a complete misnomer to even call it that. The JNRUM, which was the renewal mission, was a much more accurate description of what was actually needed for Indian cities. So this is another form of tyranny that we have to be careful about. And I'm kind of flagging these out because these rubrics actually become quite important in the way we set up the narratives of what we are trying to achieve. And then you, of course, on all of this, you have the classic global north-south divide, because these are separate issues. Often the notions of the smart city emanate, as has been written about, from the global north, and they sort of find their way, or they land as technology sold, so to speak. And it's interesting, and this is a map that's based on something Dutch architects did for the Rotterdam Biennale many years ago, which I was quite inspired by, which, it was actually based on the walled world where the walls existed between the global north and south. But what it does show you is how in the minority world, in terms of population, let's build on the idea of the human-centric metrics. You have 73% of the world's economy or income which resides in the global north, and 86 of the world's population that resides in the global south, with a disproportionately less income, right? Now, this is interesting. If you use this as a template, one of the things that we've done in our research is take many parameters which have to do with malaria, child malnutrition, water stress, cholera, many diseases. This is really a project on sanitation and public health. And this is one of the many maps we produced where it's interesting when you map those, it really falls again with a clear difference between the global north and south. And of course, except for some water stress and some parameters which creep into the global north, largely it's contained within the global south, all these sorts of challenges, right? And so that definition is one that's worth looking at. And here I find Shahidul Alam, who's the photographer, famous photographer from Bangladesh and activist, where he called it, in the context of photography biennale, he called it the majority world, where a majority of the world's population resides. And it's a way of breaking away from the third world, which was incredible aspirationally in terms of offering a third option, which Tito and Nehru and Nasser, etc., propagated as an idea. But it got burdened very quickly with the idea of, undeveloped and poor. And it seems completely inappropriate to use third world. It's really the majority world if we want to imagine urbanism like this in a kind of global context. And of course, in the majority world resides also a large part of the informal population. My colleague Joan Busquets sort of provokes us with this diagram, which is very interesting, where he talked about how traditional cities were about urbanization, which means a monarch decided that they wanted to, situate a city, and infrastructure, or it was declared to be a settlement, let's say. And then you had plot division, which means land was sold, and then you had buildings. In the garden city development in the industrializing West, the urbanization process and plot divisions collapsed, and people were sold plots of land on which they build. And this is often how suburban development sometimes happens, even in North America. The housing estates were where these collapse, which means it's a turnkey. Someone gives you an apartment because the urbanization process, plot division, and building have collapsed. Suburbs are also developed using this mode. And then in informal housing, which has now become a bulk of what we deal with, it actually is turned on its back because you have building, then through rationalizing or giving tenure of land, you have, people get ownership, which means you have the plot division. And then you have urbanization, or one comes before the other, where you have infrastructure that finds its way into these settlements. And anyway, so this is the part that I just wanted to preface, at least the way I'm sort of seeing the challenges of urbanization. And I think this then becomes the basis to sort of respond in terms of these sort of readings. And so the Kinetic City is a formulation that I believe is not restricted only to India, where my research is based, but several cities around the world, I think, where in this sort of post-industrial scenario, they have been, there's resulted a new system of the fragmentation of services and production locations, right? And this is a very clear diagram where you could predict where people were employed when factories and mills in Mumbai occurred. Mobility systems responded to that. And it was a kind of predictable flux. But when you have fragmentation of production, then mobility and how that flux occurs within the population on a temporal scale of the day, the week, is quite different, because production service locations get fragmented. And this is then results in a kind of urbanism that's created by those outside the elite domains of the formal modernity of the state, in a sense. And it's what the Indian scholar Ravi Sundaram refers to as a pirate modernity that slips under the laws of the city simply to survive without any conscious attempt at constructing a counterculture. And here, architecture is not even the single spectacle of the city. And this sort of phenomena of flux in this form of fragmented production, actually in many cities in the global
Excuse me, sir.
south. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you changing your slide? Because we are on the Kinetic City slide.
Yeah, I'm not changing it. I'm
Not changing. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Just want to confirm.
Yeah. And so this phenomena of flux is critical to these cities or nations being connected to the global economy. However, the spaces that they create have been largely excluded from the cultural discourse on globalization, which focuses on the elite domains of production in the city. And it's not what I'm describing as the kinetic city is not the city of the poor or the regular models of the formal and the informal and many other such binaries that I was reacting to. But it's a kinetic space, a space where these models collapse into a singular entity in spaces where meanings are shifting and meanings are blurred. And so the question for us as planners then becomes, can we design for this space as urban designers and planners? Can we design with a divided mind? Can other forms of organization be embedded in the discussion about our cities? How do we recognize and embed this within the formal discourse of urban design? And this is not an argument for making our cities temporary, or rather, but it's rather one of recognizing that the temporal, the notion of time as an integral part of the city, and seeing what spaces exist for within the possibility of this sort of urban design imagination, all the way from urban form to public places and governance, and even governance structures. And so, a simple way of looking at it is through this wonderful diagram, which is called the 5 stages of squatting. And the person in the image is the 3rd stage of squatting. And so it's sort of these moves that make the city. And then the city is really about appropriation. It is about incrementalism, and it's about elasticity. And that's what sort of works on this temporal scale. And public spaces, for example, get transformed. This is a, ordinary street and appropriated to become a community hall or a community center where the celebrations occur for 10. It gets dismantled and the material gets recycled. It's a plaster of Paris, it's plywood panels, it's bamboo scaffolding, and it disappears in 10 days and it actually gets recycled. Or on the cricket pitches in Mumbai, where these are public spaces, but the cricketers use it till noon or something, usually, or sometimes on a Sunday all day. But then in the evenings, it becomes a venue for weddings, which get erected using cloth and bamboo and get completely recycled. The cricket pitch is not touched because that's sacred space. But by the morning, it actually reformulates itself as a cricket ground again. So it's this elasticity, and this is the rich. This is the super rich using it. It's not the poor. And so the sense of the kind of kinetic, where the temporal, the reversible, the notion of appropriation play themselves out in the public realm. And here, architecture, as I said, is not the central instrument of the city. It's these sorts of festivals that co-opt or create synergies with the image of the city to create new spectacles. In this case, the Ganesh festival, where on the last day, hundreds of these idols, large idols of the Ganesh, of the god Ganesh, get immersed in the water. And here, immersion becomes the metaphor for the spectacle of the city, because as the clay idol dissolves in the water of the bay, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no static or permanent mechanisms to encode the spectacle. Here, the memory of the city itself is an enacted process, a temporal moment, as opposed to buildings that contain the public memory as static or permanent entities. And the city and its architecture don't even mean the same thing, are not even contained in the same space. Here, the spaces get consumed, reinterpreted, recycled. The kinetic city actually recycles the static city to create create this new spectacles. And so it's a way of perhaps imagining the city. It puts people more centrally to it. The perception and the images formed by the kind of associative values people have to space and to these spectacles, which also occur on a cyclic and a temporal kind of flux. And so it's really this notion that cities were in constant flux that inspired us to expand this research into looking at what is called ephemeral urbanism, where the word kinetic was expanded to the ephemeral in this kind of much larger encompassing temporal idea. Cities became urbanism because urbanism also is descriptive. The moment you put design, then it's propositional in urban design. So urbanism allows us to actually, look at that phenomena more broadly and, allowing many other lenses in terms of disciplines to enter the conversation. And so in this ephemeral urbanism research, the kind of provocations get much broader. And the one project I'd like to share with you here is our mapping of the Kumbh Mela, which we call mapping the ephemeral megacity. And the Kumbh Mela is a festival that occurs every 4 years on small cycles, but every 12 years on a much larger scale. And so we studied one that was occurring on the 12-year cycle. And it was an interdisciplinary project, which I'll just share with you because it will give you a sense of how this sort of research expands itself out. So these are just some images for those of you who might not have experienced this, just to give you a sense of what it sort of feels like. So, I mean, the film goes on. I just wanted to give people who hadn't seen the festival a glimpse of it, but it is the construction of a whole city that replicates a normal city, and the statistics are pretty mind-boggling. It's about, between 5 and 7 million people who reside there, and about 100 plus million people visit on the sacred day. So it is the largest gathering of human beings. So there's a whole city that's constructed. And that's what we were interested in studying. There's a lot of literature on the Kumbh Mela as a phenomena that comes from religious studies and others, but studying it as an urban entity really hadn't happened. And this was truly an interdisciplinary project where, there were 5 major schools at the university that got together to work on this. So, and it was interesting. I mean, just for all of us who also teach as an interdisciplinary project, it was fascinating because no one really had a disciplinary bias because it was so out of the box when we were all going there to think, what would we imagine? How would we understand it? How would we document and map it? And how does it work as an urban organism? Was a question that even the urban planning and urban design students weren't totally equipped to, or didn't have any preconceived biases, which allowed the kind of interdisciplinary exchange to occur much more easily. And that was one of the fundamental lessons, at least for me, in situating the project. The Mela actually occurs on the confluence of the Ganges and the Yamuna rivers. It sits in that spot near the city of Allahabad. It occurs, as I said, every 12 years. It's based on, it occurs in January on planetary alignments, and it's settled for 55 days when people visit. 7 million people live there, and there are 4 sacred days for bathing, which is what you saw in those images. And the bathing at the confluence, which is the Sangam, where the 2 rivers intersect, is the sacred spot. And of course, this project involved us going into the archives in Allahabad and understanding how they even situated it. And, there was very little documentation. It's almost a kind of self-organized occurrence, or used to be, and it's been more organized with time, but in a very broad way, which means the government really creates the broad armature within which the city or the settlement plays itself out. And from the archives, one found fascinating, documents going back to 1870, which were instructions about how this should happen. By 1954, there were diagrams which, suggested where the settlement should occur, etc., how much land should be left for it. Of course, by 2001, there were more specific drawings, and you begin to see a grid occurring, which tells you how the settlement could be laid out. And it's interesting. The reference to sectors begins to emerge. Before Chandigarh, it was really alluding to the town planning scheme kind of logic. So it, in a sense, also reflects what's perhaps popular with urban planning imaginations within the government at that time. And I can imagine how the next one will be called a smart city, perhaps. But in any case, the one that we studied in 12-13, they kind of did a very broad zoning. Now, what's interesting is the river actually is also in flux. So every year, or every 4 years and every 12 years, the alignment of the river changes marginally. And so therefore the land that's occupiable for the settlement also changes. So it kind of is sensitive or responsive to that. And the commissioner of Allahabad is the gentleman you see here, who has those maps on his wall, because he then becomes the one who makes it operational on the ground, because that's the city that adjoins the location of this settlement. And that's what it looks like when the water is present. So which means that Google image is a Google image in the fury of the monsoon, which would have been, June, July. And then when the waters recede, what you see in white are the banks of the river on which the settlement is produced. So that bank changes every time. It's a shifting landscape, and it's sand. And that's sort of what's interesting about how this is deployed in every cycle. And so from a watery landscape, it slowly over time, as the water recedes and you have the sand emerge, really the landscape or the site for the settlement sort of emerges. And this is a before and after image which we took, and you see this, the same tree from the same spot. And you see the top image was taken early September, and the bottom image was taken on the 13th or 14th of January. And the waters recede by October, which means they basically have November and December and 2 weeks in January. That means about 10 weeks to actually lay out a whole city which would accommodate 5 to 7 million people. It's an incredible sort of task. And they, of course, employ a grid which is overlaid. This is the current method. These are the roads, which are essentially metal tracks, which are just put on the sand. And that's the amazing thing about the city is there are no foundations. Everything rests very lightly on the landscape of the sand that sort of emerges. And the road infrastructure is laid out in a hierarchical way. In each sector, the grids are different depending on the lay of the land or what that sector is going to accommodate in terms of uses and sizes of plots, because each of these blocks are given to different communities, then within which self-organize. And what's incredible is every road that crosses the river goes across as a pontoon bridge. So again, this was done by a host of fabricators. And this is something we also drew up and actually created technical drawings so that it also becomes a document. And that's what gives the grid robustness, because in terms of mobility, it's incredibly efficient, because every road, or every major road at least, crosses over in the form of a pontoon bridge. And then, of course, the sectors are attributed to different communities and broadly different uses, largely residential, but within each of the blocks, different communities have their own shrines, etc. The main idea here is the ritual of bathing at the confluence of the two rivers, the Sangam. And so therefore, a lot of the logic of the layout is based on how people move to what you see as the red areas. And it tells you here the metrics in terms of how many people, the 20 million pilgrims on the busiest day, 100 million visitors over the entire Kumbh. And so everyone goes to those red zones. And so therefore the logic of the circulation takes you there. It also has amazing security, which is zoned according to the block. So this was something that we studied very carefully. And this was all by 2012, it was all done digitally, electronically, and incredibly efficiently, because of course, this becomes a great site for terrorism or for any forms of disruption that people might want to, do. And then, of course, the health infrastructure is another one, which is a combination of medical units and clinics and many hospitals, some hospitals up to 200 beds, but also, sanitation systems in terms of toilets, sewage and water supply. It's all laid as pipelines. So in many ways, it's more efficient than many Indian cities. In fact, I always say to my colleagues, it's the cleanest Indian city I've ever lived in. They have 10,000 sweepers who are working round the clock, keeping it clean. And of course, it is a religious festival, so people come with very little waste to kind of dispose. And so the flow of people is based on them arriving at the Sangam, and therefore the logic of the layout is based on that. And then this is sort of mapping of the sanitation infrastructure and the flux that would occur in terms of demand within that. So here we mapped, all the locations of sanitary infrastructure that occurred. So, I mean, this is a whole lecture in itself, but I'm just giving you some sampling. There's food infrastructure, there are common community kitchens that supply food, and there's a whole logic behind that, which is absolutely incredible and efficient. You can land up there as a pilgrim with just your clothes, and you'll find a place to live, and you'll find food every day without making any effort, really. And what is interesting is, for me, this aspect, again, as an architect, perhaps, which is the entire city is made from this kit of parts, which is 5 materials, which is 8-foot tall bamboo, nails or screw, rope or wire, and then skinning material in the form of GI sheets or tarpaulin or fabric or whatever. So let's call it a skinning material. And these 5 materials ramp up into incredible typologies, all the way from large temples that can accommodate a few thousand people to a small tent for 2 people or a family. And this is what allows its logic to construct and deconstruct so quickly, even possible. And it's a sort of kit of parts kind of approach, but it allows its recyclability. So whether it's the pontoon bridges or whether it's all this material, it actually gets recycled. The pontoon bridges go to smaller villages that might need a bridge. Some of them get stored to be reused in 4 years. And there's a great reversibility and a recyclability, which I think is very useful to learn from. And in hindsight, and I think this intersects the most with your aspirations in this conference, is what we call the material geography. And this is something we would have had to start studying much before the Mela, and maybe this is a project someone can take on. But where does the material come from and where does the material go back? I think this is potentially a fascinating topic because this is humongous in terms of scale, all the way from the food that comes in to the material for building that comes in, and therefore also where it goes. Because this really just all gets recycled. It's not thrown, and some of it is within the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is where this is located. Some outside, and Uttar Pradesh is one of India's largest and most populated states. So it's a couple of 100 million people there, but it's a fascinating area, which I think would be much related to what this discussion in this conference is about. The last thing I'd like to kind of point out here in terms of also looking the idea of governance. And here, what was fascinating to find was even the governance works on a temporal scale, which is to say that, it is a top-down process, which is what you see in red, which is a chief minister deciding and making decisions. And then it moves to the yellow, which is the bureaucrats. Hierarchies change, new actors appear on the ground. And what you see in the bottom half of the circle is everyone who gets put into place 3 months or 6 months before the occurrence of the festival, starting with the commissioner of Allahabad, the gentleman whose image I showed you, who is here, and he begins to start delegating to another set of actors. And then finally, a month or two before the festival opens, you have a Mela Adhikari, who is the circle at the bottom of the circle. And he is like the mayor of the city. And he has the ability to go outside the circle. Till that point, the actors are within what you see outlined in the circle. And it's really a fascinating idea because the hierarchies shift on a temporal scale. That's what makes it very nimble. And that's the reason why the mayor, the Mela Adhikari, who gets power for a very short period of time, 3 months before and 3 months after, has the ability to act very quickly and to report. As you can see, that bottom circle is connected only to 2 or 3 people. So he can make very quick decisions in times of a crisis when these big fluxes of people occur in space based on rituals, the sacred days for the bathing, etc. And so it starts with preparing a master plan and budget right from the top. It involves, people and politicians and leaders meeting. Then it involves the chief minister, the young man you see here on the top image, beginning to make his announcement and appoint people within the bureaucracy and otherwise who would be partners in this process. Then the bureaucrats take over, the chief secretary. He begins to start having meetings with religious leaders and other people who actually define the constituency for the city more clearly. And then it goes to the bottom where the same gentleman I showed you there is the mayor of Allahabad, or the commissioner of Allahabad, who takes over and begins to make operational. And this man at this corner with his hands up by his chin is the person who is the mayor of the Mela, who then in the next stage becomes the most operational person. And he has the ability to go outside and bring in contractors and other agents and allocate land and allocate property for people to use for those 55 days. And so it's a fascinating governance structure which works on a temporal scale. It also has a scalar implication in terms of the definition of the city, which is what you see at the bottom map, the definition of the greater Allahabad area, and then the district in which it sits within the state. And of course, then you go to the state and the national level. Now, what is interesting is this is not a pop-up city, as most people call it. It's a formal, intentional, deliberate urban system that is state-driven. It's formal because it's driven by the state. It's not people organizing themselves. And so it's a wonderful example of public-private partnership. It's a wonderful example of how the temporal imagination and scale can be embedded within kind of urban practices, but it's also tells you about what the kind of ability of the government and the state could be. And of course, this is a book which also got translated into Hindi. And so perhaps one of the early books on planning in Hindi, which has been wonderful for us. And so it was an experiment. Of course, as a result of this, well, not the criticism, but let me say the productive feedback from my colleagues was that, my God, you can't make a case for ephemeral urbanism in this way, just studying one settlement, and that to a religious festival. And of course, that was fair criticism. So the question was, how does one expand this? And what does that mean? And so we kind of expanded this rubric and to say the Kumbh is an extreme example, but there could be many other things. And we began to look at refugee camps. We looked at Burning Man. We looked at, military settlements. We looked at mining towns. And we started beginning to create, let me say, a formulation that would go beyond, just, let me say, a religious festival. And so that's how the project for this idea of extreme urbanism sort of grew. And so it really, in hindsight, this category of ephemeral urbanism, I think you can see that the issues that could be negotiated in the form of ephemeral urbanism are as diverse as memory and geography and infrastructure, sanitation, public health, governance, and ecology more broadly. And these parameters unfold their sort of, let's say, projective potential, offering alternatives not only for rethinking cases within the boundary of ephemeral urbanism, but also how to embed softer but perhaps more robust systems in more permanent imaginaries of the city. And Andrea Branzi, the famous Italian urbanist, advises us on how to think of cities of the future. And he suggests that we need to learn to implement reversibility, avoiding rigid solutions and definitive decisions. He also suggested approaches which allow space to be adjusted and reprogrammed with new activities not foreseen or not necessarily even planned. And so ephemeral urbanism as an idea then acknowledges the need for imagining or examining permanent solutions, for reimagining permanent solutions as the only mode for the formulation of urban imaginaries, and instead imagining new protocols that are constantly reformulated, readapted, reprojected in an iterative search for a temporary equilibrium that reacts to the permanent state of crisis that we now are in. And so, this is how we sort of expanded this to look at the scale and pace of contemporary urbanization, etc. And so this sort of documentation, also just to put some images to it, is a whole range of things. And I'll let you just sort of feast on these images for a couple of minutes, and then I'll proceed. So it's, I mean, I think the real learning here was that there's a whole taxonomy that is worth articulating, because in the ephemeral landscapes of transaction, it's quite different from, say, the ephemeral landscape of military or of extraction. So in extraction, the cities or the towns that are built, some of them are quite large, last till the resource lasts. So it could be 50 years, it could be 100 years, as in copper mines, etc. in Chile. Whereas the ephemeral landscapes of transaction work on sometimes a daily rhythm, and that's the kind of flux you have to capture. The religion works on cyclic events which are annual, or like 4 years, 12 years. Strife is unexpected. Celebration is also based on rhythms that are predictable. Refuge, I mean, look at what's happening with the Rohingya camps. It's millions of people. These are like mega cities, and military too. And each of them have different purposes. So like in religion, there's a single purpose. So when you have a singular focus and common purpose without any contestations, often the success chances are higher, therefore the Kumbh. But when you have contestations when refugee camps, or with even strife, that is through disasters, the contestations are incredible, because those landscapes emerge out of these forms of contestation. And so therefore one has to have different parameters for them. And therefore this was then put together as a book where all these taxonomies through case studies have been elaborated. And the really central question is, does permanence matter? Which is really arguing for the temporal and the imagination of time as a way of rhythms, but also the notion of understanding what is the expiration date of any formulation of a settlement or gathering, because that then allows us to imagine in terms of urban design and planning things quite differently. And I think that has implications also in the way you might discuss the circular economy, because I think that becomes a very critical factor in that sort of discussion. The last part of this research I now come to, which is then how do you expand this, say, in the case of India, at a different scale, and what does it mean? What can we learn from the Kinetic City, from ephemeral urbanism? And I think those learnings are enormous, and that's the challenge we are right now engaged with. So this is just work in progress, and I hope it will be a book in a few months. But here, it's called Becoming Urban, and it's really asking the question, what is even urban in India? Because India's story of urbanization has largely focused on the dramatic accumulation of population and capital in large cities, and the city-centric perspective reinforces the bias towards specific morphologies and privileges certain planning paradigms that essentialize the diversity of city making and simplify or even ignore the networks and fields upon which concentrated urban development depends. And I think this lens does not even equip us to manage the transformative shifts in India's smaller towns and villages. Our narrative attempts to shed light on this process of urbanization taking place in India. And so, these are the three criteria that we use in India: population over 5,000, density of 400 people per square kilometer, and over 75% of the male population in non-agricultural employment. And you get these small and big dots. But if we deconstruct each of these parameters, so if you take just population, and let's say take population and density, you get a completely different reading of urban India, right? So the first map shows you that India is 47% urban. But if I take the density parameter, then India becomes 70% urban. That's a huge difference. It's also a complete different implication in terms of morphologies, because the 400% density shows you there's an urban agrarian field, because that's the Indo-Gangetic plain. And so these are, and we try to collapse this. I think we get the wrong answers then for what urbanism means. And if I take the 400% density parameter, and you place that with 75% of the male population having to be in non-agricultural uses, actually you get a completely different reading, because everyone in the Indo-Gangetic plain is also doing agricultural activity. And so these are different parameters. And of course, we've made different maps. This is a project I've done with a colleague called Saurav Bishwas, who and we are trying to put this together with several other students involved into a kind of alter reading, so to speak, of what is happening with urbanization. And then, of course, on top of that, if you recognize that 90% of India's economy is informal, that of course throws another kind of parameter, because then you have questions of migration. You know, I mean, just the indication, and this is IIM Ahmedabad's data, 30 million people walked back or found their way back to villages in the 2 weeks after the 48-hour notice of the lockdown, which was draconic, brutal actually. You know, if you take that metric for 2 weeks, can you imagine how many hundreds of millions of people go back and forth and therefore are employed both in agriculture and non-agriculture simultaneously? And, you know, so if you take just say example, rice, this is the rice market, and India is one of the largest rice exporters. Then you begin to take rice cropping and growing areas, take the railway systems, you can begin to start predicting these fluxes. And that's sort of really, so really the thesis of this work is that India has about 14,000 what we call transitioning settlements that accommodate about 200 million people. This is 2011 census data. This will only have grown. And these settlements is what allows this sort of movement. It's a fine pixelation between the big cities and the hinterlands. And these are the transitional areas which not only allow people to access towns and cities more easily, but these are all becoming urban. They'll soon meet all the parameters. There are many places in this 13,650 that are 150,000 people settlements and yet defined as villages. This is a complete aberration. And so therefore, what is urban India is really a question that we have to examine more carefully. But essentially, I think just to end, what I would say is, I think what we have to do is to challenge the idea of the city as a static and stable entity. And I think when we do that, then we premise architecture as the central instrument for organizing the city. But that doesn't recognize the flux. And I think if we have to look at the circular economy seriously, I think it can be a very inspirational category in reverse too, in terms of the ways it can inform the imagination of the city. And for me, the ephemeral, the reversible, this notion of embedding the idea of time, the idea of the life cycle of materials, so life cycle implies time, is all very, very critical if we have to facilitate a transition to the circular economy. And I think that is incredibly critical for us to think more sustainably about our cities and about our life on the planet. So thank you very much. And I hope these thoughts and provocations might be useful in the further discussion. So thank you again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for that very insightful talk. With that, I just open the floor for the participants for having a small interactive session. So there is one question from Professor Anand Vadvekar. In which sector do you see the possibility of overlap of circular economy, closed system, vis-a-vis ephemeral, constant cities?
Birth for imagining.
Future cities.
Sorry, I'm just reading it now. In which sector do you see the possibility of the overlap of circular closed system vis-a-vis ephemeral, constant birth and rebirth for imagining? You know, I mean, I think, well, for the sector of transaction is the easiest one, because transaction and those economies, when I say transaction, I mean all forms of exchange, are so unpredictable. I mean, I always point out in America, there are 2,000 malls with large parking lots just lying abandoned because the nature of transaction, especially in the world going forward, is changing enormously. And so those spaces are ones that I think we should start with. And then, of course, there's a whole range of related things, all the way from food to many other forms of exchange that occur. I don't know if that answers your question, Anand.
If there are any questions, you can, the participants can actually put in Q&A, or you can type it in the chat box. There are a lot of comments in the chat box, how this has been, how the ephemerality that you had discussed, how it could be related to circular economy, and also flattening of hierarchies that you had mentioned, a very interesting analysis.
Yeah, I mean, also to go back to Anand's question, I think even governance, I mean, I think just showing that Kumbh Mela, and I don't know what that means exactly for cities, but what I know, having done some of these studies and then reflecting on our cities, is that often more than even the buildings, which imply a kind of permanence and legacy and all of that, sometimes governance systems are very stiff and hierarchical, which allow us not to be as nimble as we should be, given the flux that our planet is experiencing. And so I mean, I think Anand, I think one could play this out in some interpretive form in many other domains and sectors. And I think this is where I feel the whole smart cities imagination of imagining the technology as the silver bullet solving the problems is ridiculous. I think the way we should be formulating this is calling it the digital in cities. That what is the role that digital can play in cities? Because cities are made of different domains, and it's the networking and the movement of information between these domains that make for those efficiencies. But if you have cities where those domains don't exist, whether it's public health infrastructure, sanitation, etc., what are you networking? Where are the flows going? So I think this sort of broader ecological thinking is very critical. And then I think many possibilities arise in ways where Anand, one could, look at examples where one can play this out.
Yeah, thank you, sir. There's one more question from Anushri. Would you be able to give us an idea about how do you think the concept of circular economy would impact post-COVID architecture?
The short answer is I don't know, but let me try to think about it. Would you be able to give us an idea about how do you think the concept of circular would impact post? Well, I mean, the simple answer is this provocation, does permanence matter? Which means I think I think we just generally have to be more nimble. We should be careful that we are not making permanent, or let's say even what does permanent mean? Let's say we are not making long-term solutions for short-term problems, right? That's where, again, this temporal image, we have to ask ourselves that question. So we have to critically negotiate and ask the question, are we confident that a problem that we are imagining is a problem that needs a response where you lock up material resources and embodied energy for decades? Or should it be a solution where that resource deployment should be nimble enough that it can be reversed and recycled or upscaled or whatever in 5 years, right? We don't take the notion of time seriously enough, and that's why, whether it's in an architecture school or in the way we imagine any project, we take permanence as a default condition, right? And that has implications in the way material resources are embodied, in the way we lock resources. It then has implications on modes of extraction, etc. So I think, what I've tried to do in this provocation is, for your discussion on circular economy, is to say city making is a good start, because we know when we talk about sustainability, climate change, we know cities are the most implicated, right? And then we start looking for the problem elsewhere. We start giving density a bad name. We do this, that, and the other. But I think the fundamental question is that of resources, and how we lock resources, in what form we lock resources, and for how long we lock resources, correct? And so, I think those would be the kinds of ways you could think about this. Again, I don't know if it answers your question, Anushri, but I'm sorry, it's broader.
There's another question from Professor Shaleen Singhal. How do you see the linkages between the phenomenon of ephemeral cities and unique patterns of consumption?
Well, I think, in fact, the ephemeral allows you to, it's I think, Shaheen, or Shaleen, sorry, your question is related to what I've just said, which is, which is, I think we have to be nimble, because those unique patterns of consumption we can't predict, and they don't stay unique forever often, right? So they also have to be reversible. And I think that's really, in my view, the sort of critical thing. But also I want to just sort of re-clarify that when I would not use ephemeral cities. That's the reason one changed it to ephemeral urbanism, because ephemeral cities then imply something like the Kumbh Mela. And my argument is not that we should be making large cities like that temporary, but what we can learn from it, right? So it's about embedding these sorts of softer imaginations within existing cities. So when we plan new cities, let's say, or when we're expanding existing cities, we should keep the space for ephemeral urbanism. We should keep the space in the reservations in the same way as we have open space. We should have spaces reserved for 5-year uses, 10-year uses, 20-year uses, 1-week uses, 1-day uses, which can be on these sorts of temporal cycles, which will allow us within cities to adapt very nimbly the needs and these unique forms of consumption. But if we lock in our land use planning or whatever mechanism we use, master planning, strategy planning, etc., or development plans, if we lock all the space in true preconceived attributed uses, then we have no leeway for that flexibility, and therefore then we are not nimble, right? And so the argument, and that's why it shifts from kinetic city to ephemeral urbanism as the phenomena. How do you make the space for that? It's not about ephemeral cities. Yes, the Kumbh Mela is an ephemeral megacity, but my argument more theoretically within the rubric of ephemeral urbanism is how do we embed these systems within our existing imagination of the city. It's not, again, it can't be a binary. It's not this or that. We need both. How do they both find space together? How do we blur that binary is the critical question.
Yeah, thank you. Any more questions? There is a comment by Munawar Irfan in the chat telling that he thinks perhaps the integration of ephemeral urbanism into the planning model can build resilience of our cities towards climate change, COVID, etc.
Exactly. So Munawar, you're absolutely right. And I mean, I just will expand that. Absolutely. You know, it can help do many things. I mean, I could have, instead of alluding to the circular economy, I could have ended this by talking about climate change. And what happens now with climate change is, you know, we have two situations. So there are two approaches, as you know. One is to buffer existing cities. So Manhattan is building a big buffer around it. Or it is managed retreat, right, where you try to retreat into safer areas. Now, the buffering, which of course the Dutch have done skillfully for centuries, but in its present form, again, that's why I had that map of coastal cities. That buffering is going to happen in all the coastal cities, is essentially to secure all that capital that has been invested there. No one will want to give away that value so easily. And therefore, it's kind of the narratives are driven by the private sector, of course, with the state co-opted in it. For managed retreat, it's a longer process. It's a whole generation, right? Therefore, we have to shift, say, in questions of Mumbai into the metropolitan imagination. The state has to play a big role in that transition of managed retreat. And I think the ephemeral landscape can also play a big role in doing that, which is, you know, uses are set up to attract people, to create incentives, and then those can be reversed over time, because managed retreat is it's a design of transitions. And this is the other thing that we have to shift away in urban planning and design, is from thinking only in terms of end state planning or absolute solutions to actually challenging ourselves in terms of designing transitions. And the design of transitions is quite different, you know. I mean, I think, for example, the sanitation projects that in the Swachh Bharat that we have undertaken, I think the aspiration to provide a toilet for every family is a great one. But to prefabricate them in a factory and drop them outside everyone's door is an absolute solution, because in large informal settlements, in large conglomerations, there's not even the place for that, right? So community toilets is a transition to fulfilling sanitation, because finally housing is related to broader urbanization, and till one solves that broader urbanization, one is not going to fully solve sanitation. So to have absolute solutions is a waste of investment. You have to think in transitionary terms. So I think if one shifts our thinking in these ways, then the ephemeral becomes a very critical instrument. The ephemeral coupled with architecture as an instrument. I'm not saying it can be one or the other that solves the problem. It has to be both of those working in synchrony. It will increase the margin of possible solutions, whether it's for a circular economy or it's for making these transitions to a circular economy or making a transitions, I think, to better cities.
Thank you, sir. I hope there are no more questions. And I think we are almost to the end of the session. May I just request Dr. Nikhil Ranjan Mandal, our Dean Academics, to convey a vote of thanks to the guest of honor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Surekha.
Thank you so much, sir. We listened very aptly to your argument that how to make transitions to a circular economy through ephemeral urbanism. And that was extraordinary presentation and thinking, and really inspiring to think in different lines. I hope all our listeners will find some kind of inspiration from this thinking to work in their own ways for circular economy. I am actually in place of Dr. N. Sridharan, who would have been here, but he has just left for another meeting. So thank you so much, sir, for joining us for this evening. And we hope to see you again in some other workshop or some other engagement. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and enjoy the rest of the conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. My heartfelt gratitude. When I requested, you promptly agreed for this particular keynote to deliver, and also to setting up the whole theme and the premise and the tone for the 2 days to go for the workshop. So thank you so much for that. We look forward for more sessions with you, and also taking up your time from the very busy schedule. And also it's really early morning. So thank you for that also. And I would like to thank everyone who had joined this inaugural session. Thank you so much. For the participants, tomorrow we will start our session formally at 10:45. You can start logging in at 10:15. You can check the program schedule sent to you by mail. So have a nice evening and see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Surekha. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, sir.
Bye.